The COVID-19 pandemic has caused the highest rates of unemployment in American history, and with that has driven many into housing insecurity.
A slight correction is in order. It's not the COVID-19 pandemic that caused all that, but rather the mandatory state lockdowns, which were an absurd overreaction to the COVID-19 pandemic.
With pandemic unemployment assistance expired and millions still unemployed, America is about to face the largest homelessness crisis in our history. As of right now, as I write this, they're saying that somewhere between 30 and 40 million people will be at risk of homelessness. And although things could happen before I publish this that could change that, we will almost certainly see hundreds of thousands or even millions of people become homeless. This isn't just a COVID-19 problem, though. Even before the pandemic, almost 600,000 people in America were homeless, and millions more were housing insecure.
Okay, yeah, this was also kind of a problem before the whole COVID thing, but a majority, I'd say probably 90% of the housing issue we're facing right now is due to the government's idiotic overreaction to this little virus.
In the San Jose metro area, only 11.6% of housing is affordable for a median income renter. Only 5.6% in the Los Angeles metro and 19.7% in the New York metro.
You know, I find it absolutely hysterical how whenever left-wingers argue that we have a housing crisis in America, they immediately point to cities and states run by liberals as examples to prove their point.
But this isn't just a problem for New York and California. Only 18.1% of housing in Bloomington, Indiana is affordable for a median income renter. 16.1% in Missoula, Montana, 21% in Mobile, Alabama, and 21.3% of housing in Martinsburg, West Virginia is affordable.
So first of all, I have no idea where he's getting this data from since he didn't provide any links to sources in the video description. This is made especially problematic considering there's some ambiguity as to what's considered affordable. You know, affordability is somewhat subjective. You know, different people have different amounts they're willing and able to spend, and therefore different price ranges they would consider to be affordable. But even assuming that this data is accurate, it would still appear as if states that are more Republican or right-leaning seem to have higher on-average affordable housing. So even if this data was completely accurate, it would still more likely than not undermine his position.
Housing is a really big problem in America, and today we're going to look at why and what we can do to fix it.
While I do certainly agree that housing is somewhat of an issue here in America, I take it we're most likely going to disagree on why that is and how to fix it. Oh, and spoiler alert, he blames capitalism.
And consider supporting independent progressive media at patreon.com/Lucretia report.
You know, I always thought it was funny how these left-wing progressive YouTubers always seem to argue that the free market can't be trusted to fund public services voluntarily, and then proceed to show their Patreon page. Speaking of which, consider supporting independent libertarian media by going to patreon.com/philosophossum. Link is in the description.
So I guess I should make a quick note right up top that homelessness and the housing crisis aren't the same thing. A lot of homelessness is caused by housing prices, but there are other causes too, like our lackluster mental health treatment and our treatment of former prisoners, which I've covered in the past, so this video is going to be about housing.
Okay, I'll give credit where credit's due. He is correct about this. Homelessness has a variety of different contributing factors and is an altogether separate issue from the housing crisis. This is why I have to give this guy credit here, because when a lot of left-wingers talk about the housing problem in America, they lump that issue together in with homelessness.
The core problem with housing in the United States obviously is that rent just keeps going up and incomes haven't gone up nearly as much. Between 1960 and 2016, median rent adjusted for inflation went up 61.5%. But in that same time period, median income adjusted for inflation went up only 5.2%. And while incomes have risen and fallen with the economy, rent prices have just kept going up. So that's obviously going to create problems.
Well, yes, that would obviously create problems, but one has to wonder why it is that rent prices continuously increase disproportionately compared to average income. Because you see, in a natural free market, prices and income levels usually try and remain proportional to each other. This is because producers of commodities aren't going to make any money if the consumer isn't able to afford to purchase it from them. The only way that prices and income levels can veer off drastically like they do here is due to external non-market intervention, which is exactly what's causing these rent spikes. When you look at where most of these rent spikes are occurring, they're in places where government introduces a lot of regulations. These regulations raise the operating costs of the buildings, which subsequently raises the amount of rent that the landlord has to charge.
And the obvious culprit would be supply of housing, right? The fundamental rule of economics is supply and demand. If supply goes down and demand stays the same or goes up, then prices go up. And according to the census, between 1968 and 2019, 72.76 million housing units were built, but the United States population increased by 122.4 million. The population has grown more than 40% more than the supply of housing.
Again, he doesn't cite his sources in the description, so I have no way to verify if this data is accurate. But there's a more glaring issue with this argument right here. You see, in order to use statistics in your arguments, you have to make it clear what the terms you're using actually mean. Otherwise, you're just throwing out numbers with no way to contextualize what they actually mean. Allow me to explain. In this argument, Ian attempts to get his point across by comparing the increase in population and quantity of housing units constructed since a given year. The problem with this is that the term housing unit is never actually defined. What counts as a housing unit? For example, suppose you have a 3-bedroom apartment versus a 30-bedroom mansion. Would both of these equally be considered a housing unit, even though they have different capacities of people?
But since not every house from 1968 is still around, a bunch of them are probably gone, that means that it's even worse than that.
I wouldn't be so quick to underestimate the quality of old school construction techniques. I'd actually wager on a lot of those houses from the 60s still being around, especially considering that's way before the whole trend of real estate developers using shitty prefabs from China to build gaudy gentrified neighborhoods while saving a buck.
So the demand is outstripping the supply, and that's obviously going to cause prices to go up. So the obvious answer should just be to build more houses, right? Just build more houses. And while that is the solution, obviously it's not as simple as that.
No, actually it is really that simple. All you really need to do to solve the housing crisis is get rid of zoning laws and all the other government red tape in the way and just let people build housing. It really is that simple.
One of the problems is the double punch of urbanization and government disinterest.
Nigga, what?
You're blaming government disinterest? Dude, are we like on the same fucking planet here? Because the government heavily has its nose in housing and construction. Building codes, zoning laws, rent control. Heck, in some neighborhoods you need government permission just to put a barbecue on your back porch.
In 2015, more than 80% of people in America lived in cities, and that's projected to be almost 90% of Americans by 2045. This means that most demand for housing in the United States is being concentrated into smaller and smaller areas. And when that happens, those same economic forces come into play with land, especially land in cities, becoming much more expensive. This makes it more expensive to build in cities and makes it simply not profitable for developers to build affordable housing in cities. Take Central Park Tower, for example. Right in the middle of downtown Manhattan, it's on some of the most expensive real estate in the world. The land that it's on alone was worth $520 million.
That sure does seem like a lot of money, but you have to take a moment to consider why exactly it is that land in the city costs that much. Like Ian hinted at earlier, it basically comes down to supply and demand. A lot of people want to go move to the city, but the city only has so much space to go around. This issue becomes compounded when you consider the fact that it's not just residential development vying for space in the city. A lot of commercial and industrial operations are looking to set up shop in the city as well. Big cities are usually major hubs for business and commerce, which makes sense why a lot of big companies want to set up their offices there. This further adds to the demand for the limited space within the city.
If they decided that they were going to make that building all average-sized 2-bedroom apartments, they would be able to fit 1,129 of them in there. Let's imagine then that they try to make those affordable. Affordable housing is usually defined as 30% or less of median income. So let's be generous and say that they price all of those at exactly 30% of median New York income. It would still take, at 100% occupancy, more than 30 years just to pay off the land that that building is on, and that's the tallest residential building in the world.
Okay, well the solution here is rather simple. Just build that affordable housing in a different neighborhood where the land's not so expensive.
Obviously, developers are going to look at that and realize that if they want to make a profit, They simply can't build affordable housing in cities.
Well, because I cherry-picked this one particular location that just so happens to be in a neighborhood where land prices are high, I guess that just proves definitively once and for all, beyond any sort of doubt whatsoever, that it's not profitable to build affordable housing in cities. Checkmate, libertarians.
So if you leave it up to the free market, as some would tell us to do, well, that's how you get a housing crisis. If you leave it up to the free market, economic factors will prohibit affordable housing.
So yeah, he's basically blaming the housing crisis on the free market. He doesn't provide much of an explanation as to how exactly it is the free market is at fault. The very little explanation he does give involves a lot of cherry-picked data and empty speculation. And of course all of this is ignoring the big elephant in the room, which is that we've never really had a free market for housing. The real estate industry is and always has been heavily regulated by government. So he's blaming our troubles on a free market for housing when a free market for housing never really existed.
So what we have to do is change those factors. And in my view, there are 3 ways to do that.
So who wants to guess they're all going to be euphemisms for point guns at people?
You can A, increase the supply, B, artificially decrease the costs, or C, just not leave it up to the free market. And in reality, we'll probably have to do all 3. Increasing supply is probably the easiest way for cities and states to address housing costs. And one way that you can do that is by addressing a lot of the problems that restrict housing supply.
You are correct, sir!
Yes, bingo, right on the money. I completely agree. The easiest way to make housing more available is to get rid of things that restrict the supply of housing. So I bet he's going to agree with me that we should get rid of things like zoning laws, building codes, and rent control, right?
Airbnb and similar services are one of those.
So you agree with me that we should get rid of things that cause restrictions on housing supply, but instead of, I don't know, the pages and pages of codes and regulations that make it expensive to build housing, what initially comes to mind for you is Airbnb of all things. Well, I honestly shouldn't be shocked that liberals have a problem with Airbnb. You see, 2 things that liberals tend to turn their nose up at are landlords and the whole smartphone gig economy. Since Airbnb is sort of a combination of the 2, it's quite fitting that liberals would have a bone to pick with it.
Now, to be clear, there was a housing crisis before Airbnb.
Well, yes, that's because there were zoning laws, building codes, and rent control before Airbnb, which makes it all the more strange that you would immediately choose Airbnb as the scapegoat for all our housing issues.
But they did make it worse.
I'm curious to know exactly how it is that Airbnb would make the housing crisis worse. Because if anything, Airbnb actually makes housing more affordable and accessible for lower class people. I have some friends who told me that before things like Uber and DoorDash were a thing, they weren't able to afford their own car. Now, thanks to the so-called gig economy, they're able to take out a loan to get a car, and by making deliveries with these apps, they were able to sort of have the car pay for itself. I could see a similar situation arising with Airbnb. It's completely foreseeable that perhaps there's some low-income people out there who would be able to get out a loan to buy a house and using Airbnb sort of have the house pay for itself, thus granting them access to something they couldn't afford previously and improving their quality of life.
Airbnb is supposed to be for things like people who have an extra room or are going to be out of town for a few days to make a little bit of money off of. And if it works the way that it's supposed to, it would actually help the housing crisis. But unfortunately, it doesn't always work the way that it's supposed to.
I'm sorry, did Airbnb make you their official spokesperson or something? Because I'm curious to know where exactly you get the gumption to officially speak on behalf of what their platform is for or how it's supposed to be used.
A lot of landlords have realized that if they put their units up on Airbnb all the time, they can make more money from short-term rentals than they can from monthly rent. But that of course means taking housing units off the market, which constricts supply, and, well, you know what happens next.
Well, I mean, it is their building. It's their private property, and if they own it fair and square, they have the right to decide how to use it.
A lot of cities have already tried to address this. One of the most common methods is by setting a maximum number of days that a unit can be on Airbnb or a similar platform if it's not an official hotel. And if you set this maximum number of days, below what it would take to make more money off of that than from monthly rentals, you disincentivize landlords from taking units off the market.
Except you wouldn't, because the underlying market conditions that make short-term renting more profitable would still be there. All you'd really be doing is putting a cap on the maximum number of days a person could rent out a unit. So instead of having one person rent out a unit for 10 days, you'd just have 2 people renting out the unit for 5 days consecutively. Plus, it seems like it would be pretty easy to circumvent. Like, there's probably a lot of different ways you could figure out how to circumvent this. For example, a landlord could declare they're building a hotel that just so happens to have some long-term apartments in it. That's one possible way I came up with, but there's probably plenty of others.
Other cities have experimented with things like setting a maximum number of short-term rentals in a particular area.
Well, first of all, this wouldn't actually guarantee that there'd be more long-term housing available. All this regulation does is restrict the ability of property owners to use their property as a short-term rental. It doesn't guarantee that they'll use it as a long-term rental. But I also foresee a lot of other negative side effects of this regulation. The famous economist Frederick Bastiat once said, you have to look at both the seen and the unseen. What that basically means is that if you're proposing an economic policy, you have to look at not just the immediate direct results of that policy, but also the more indirect side effects of it as well, which is something that a lot of left-wingers tend not to do. So let's take a look at what sort of side effects this type of policy may have. Well, if a city were to decide that we're going to put a cap on the amount of short-term rental space available in a particular area, that would obviously raise the price of short-term rentals in that area, because as we've already established, when you restrict supply, you increase the cost. Now, suppose that you and your friends just want to go and chill on the beach for the weekend. When you go to find a place to stay, you'll see that since the government just put a cap on the amount of short-term rental space available in an area, all of the available space will be either booked up or the little that is available will be prohibitively expensive, which means that you and your friends won't be able to go to the beach that weekend or will have to pick a different town to go to the beach at. And while if you and your friends aren't going to the beach in that town, it also means you're not buying sunglasses and sandals in that town. It means you're not buying funnel cakes and lemonades in that town. It means you're not going on rides and playing games on the pier in that town. And it's not just you and your friends, it's every group of friends that want to go to the beach in that town that weekend. So if this pattern continues enough times, what will happen is the tourism industry in that town will tank, which will result in a lot of people out of a job, which will result in a lot of people not being able to afford rent, which, you guessed it, will add to the housing crisis. So when you propose an economic policy, you have to consider not just what you're directly looking to accomplish with that policy, but also some of the more indirect effects it may have.
But even though the cities have these rules, a lot of landlords still ignore them.
Oh my God, who the hell cares?
Again, it's their private property. They can do with it as they please and it's none of your business. Like none of us have the right to make rules for property we don't own, yet somehow or another the government just magically gets this right.
Which will mean that more enforcement will be necessary.
German, hello?
Ach, guten Morgen. My name is SpongeBob.
Say what?
Guten Morgen. My name is SpongeBob. Ik bin gekommen mijn alte Heimat besuchen.
So in a nutshell, what enforcement basically means is someone threatening you with a gun in order to control you. This is what socialism is, folks. People threatening you with a gun to restrict how you can use your own property because some bureaucrat somewhere thinks they know how to use it better. In addition to the moral issues posed by enforcement, there's also more practical ones. For example, does the government have the resources and manpower to monitor how every single property owner in an entire town uses their property? Especially given the possibility of people finding loopholes to the regulations, as I've mentioned previously. Maybe for like a small town this would be feasible to enforce, but for a city like New York, where each neighborhood gets its own zip code, you can basically forget about it.
Another way to increase supply is through parking regulations. There's a lot of reasons to limit parking space. It incentivizes people to use public transportation, it makes cities more walkable.
I never understood why exactly it is that we should be encouraging people to use public transportation. Maybe it's just an efficient market distribution of resources, that wealthier people who can afford their own cars aren't taking up seats on buses and trains for poorer people who rely on those forms of transportation. Also, unless the bus or train station is walking distance from where you live, which at least in my neighborhood it isn't. You typically still need a car and therefore parking space in order to utilize that public transport. As for making cities more walkable, yeah, I agree, that's a good thing to do. But you wouldn't need to restrict parking in order to do that.
But it also means that there's more area that can be developed on. A lot of cities have unreasonably high minimum parking requirements, which often leads to parking lots like these right in the middle of cities. That's a lot of space that can't be used for housing right now, and even if you put all that in a garage, that's still space that can't be used for housing.
Okay, I'll agree with him on this. Mandatory minimum parking requirements from city governments often do result in a lot of excess space being allocated to parking, which could be more efficiently used in a different way. Also adding to this problem are building codes and zoning laws, which restrict the ability of people to build their parking space as a garage, and therefore have it take up less space, and also requirements that a certain percentage of your parking spaces have to be handicap accessible, which basically means that those parking spaces can only ever be used by a small percentage of the population, which according to research aren't actually heavily inconvenienced by having to park a little further away from the building.
Besides increasing the cost of a building, big parking lots also mean less space for buildings and less space for housing.
Not necessarily. You see, this is another area where free market innovation comes into play. You see, real estate developers want to get the most utility out of their building for the least amount of space taken up. This results in some actually pretty clever ways that space can be utilized to accommodate parking. One thing you might see in a lot of cities is the basement or first couple floors of the building being used as a parking garage. That way the parking doesn't actually increase the footprint of the building. Another thing you'll see in apartments and condo buildings built near the water are parking spaces for boats. So if wherever you need to go is either along the water or has a place to park your boat, you can avoid taking the road entirely. So it's not necessarily the case that providing more parking means less space for other things.
Cities shouldn't have minimum parking requirements. They should have maximum parking requirements.
Actually, there should be no parking requirements at all whatsoever, because it's illegitimate for a third party to forcibly determine how someone else can use their own property. On top of that, because of something called the information problem, there's no way for a central planner to determine what the optimal quantity of anything, including parking spaces, would be. If you're going to argue that the government should set a maximum amount of parking space, who gets to determine what that amount should be and on what basis? And also, as I mentioned before, you have to consider what sort of potential unintended side effects the policy you're pushing for may have. If you restrict the amount of parking space available in a city, that's going to increase the number of people parking along the street, or people driving around the city looking for a place to park, both of which are likely to cause traffic congestion, which is very likely to slow down the economy of your city. You know, if your business is difficult to access, if it's hard to find a place to park around it, there's a very high likelihood that that business isn't going to stick around very long. And while it would be nice to just have more people take public transportation, you have to understand the reality of it. For better or worse, America just has a very strong car culture. We simply embrace the freedom of the open road, more so than Europeans and Japanese and other countries that are cited as places that have better public transportation. And this is something that's very unlikely to change anytime soon.
And maybe the biggest issue with supply is density. America's famous for sprawling acres of single-family homes, but that's the most expensive and most environmentally detrimental way to build.
So, in the beginning of this video, you mentioned that one of the reasons that land is so expensive in the city is because a lot of people want to go move to the city, and there's only so much land there to go around. If a bunch of people all moving into the city at once is causing the price of land there to shoot up, maybe the way to make housing more affordable is to sprawl out a little bit.
If we want to build affordable housing, that simply isn't a sustainable option. I know that you want to have your yard and your quiet cul-de-sac, but if we keep building that way, this is going to keep being a problem.
I know you want to live free and enjoy a particular lifestyle, one that has become a staple of American culture, but you see, if you don't hand over the right to dictate how you live to a group of bureaucrats, this is going to keep being a problem. There used to be a guy named Computing Forever. He's a YouTuber from Ireland, and his channel recently got deleted off of YouTube for a COVID wrongthink. He still continues to make content on other platforms. But one of the things he'd always talk about is something called the Great Reset. It seems like the left wing has some sort of obsession with getting people to live in cities. Like, the left seems to push for everyone to move out of the suburbs and the countryside and everyone go live in a city. And Computing Forever says he thinks this is because if a bunch of people are living all closely together, that makes them a lot easier for the government to monitor and regulate and control their lives. I think there may be some plausibility to that.
In most cities, the most cost-effective height for housing is somewhere between 6 to 8 floors. That will require rezoning to allow high-density residential in more than just a few downtown neighborhoods.
Or maybe zoning can just not be a thing and everyone's just free to use their own property however they see fit. That sounds like a much simpler solution to me.
And that'll require getting past NIMBY concerns. I get it, you don't want high-density housing in your neighborhood. You don't want solar farms in your neighborhood. You don't want anything but beautiful single-family homes in your neighborhood. But they have to go somewhere, and everybody says that. So, we're probably just gonna have to stop listening to you nearly as much.
You know what's a very simple and straightforward way to get around NIMBY concerns? Just have private property rights. You know, that way if you own a piece of property, you just get to decide what to build on it. And if people in surrounding properties don't like it, well then that's kind of tough for them. They would have to either move, try to voluntarily convince you to do something different on your property, or prove that what you're doing on your property is somehow adversely affecting their property, which the burden would be entirely on them.
The second way to deal with housing costs is to insert artificial adjustments to economic forces. Developers simply won't ever make a profit off of building affordable housing, so they're not going to do it on their own. If we want them to do it, we're going to have to make it profitable. This can be done with subsidies and tax incentives. We can take a developer and we can say, hey, I know right now you have to make all these fancy apartments to make your money back. But what if you build affordable housing and then I chip in something to make up the difference? Basically say, if you build affordable housing, we'll give you enough money or we'll give you enough tax breaks that it's profitable for you. Cue the fiscal conservatives fainting.
So where exactly is all this money going to come from? You see, socialists often talk about subsidies as if it's just the government handing out free money. They never seem to mention where that money's going to end up coming from. And there's a reason for this. It makes what they're advocating for seem more appealing, while sort of masking over the side effects of it. To put it simply, government money typically comes from one of two places: taxation or the printing press. Taxation is the involuntary appropriation of privately owned wealth. It's basically robbery or extortion. Nobody ever actually calls it that, because the government somehow or another magically got this separate moral standard from the rest of us. And printing money results in inflation. Now both taxation and inflation basically have the same ultimate effect on the free market. They both redirect wealth away from however the market would have used it more efficiently. With taxation, you're directly taking the money out of the private sector, while inflation doesn't directly take the money itself. It sort of sucks the purchasing power out of it. They both ultimately have the same effect though. Firms in the free market now have less resources to work with, which means that businesses might have a harder time operating. This may ultimately result in the businesses going under because they can't afford the taxes, or they had the value sucked out of their assets by inflation, which means that everyone who worked for those businesses is out of a paycheck, can't pay the rent, and guess what? That contributes to the housing crisis.
We should probably do this for both affordable housing in general and for high-density housing, which would increase supply.
Sure, maybe it would increase supply, but it would increase demand as well. You see, there's actually other problems with subsidies besides siphoning off resources the market would have used more efficiently. A big downside to subsidies is that they interfere with incentives. One of the key rules of the market is to incentivize efficient use of resources. For example, if a particular resource becomes low in supply, its price will go up, and that will encourage people to either use less of that resource, use it more efficiently, or find an alternative. Subsidies interfere with those incentives and cause people to use resources suboptimally, often in very detrimental and unintended ways. To explain why this is the case, let's take a look at the example Ian brought up in the beginning of the video. A lot of people are wanting to move into the city at once, which is causing the price of land there to rapidly increase. This is actually acting as a market signal that too many people are trying to crowd into the city at once and that people should sprawl out a bit. By introducing a subsidy to make housing artificially cheaper in the city, not only are you completely failing to address the original problem, there's still more people who want to live in the city than there is space to go around. Artificially making the housing cheaper there doesn't get rid of that problem. But you're also making the problem worse, because by making that housing artificially cheaper than it should be, you're encouraging more people to live there, which is going to continue to make the city overly crowded, which is going to make the problem worse. The supply of land is going to run thinner and thinner, the price per square foot is going to go up and up, and you're going to have to pour more and more money into the subsidy program. And that's not even getting into all the strain that this overpopulation is going to put on the rest of the city's infrastructure, like water, sewer, electricity, trash collection, traffic management. Hey, but don't worry, I guess we can just have the government throw infinite money at those too, right?
Another thing you could do would be to require a certain number of affordable units per high-end unit. Singapore does something like this. Instead of having buildings that are high-end buildings and buildings that are low-end buildings, they have mixed-income buildings. Besides increasing social cohesion and breaking down barriers between classes, this also affects economic forces.
Mixed income buildings aren't actually unique to Singapore. A lot of places actually have them. This is because rental properties, just like any other business, typically wants to attract as many customers as possible. When you only offer options in one price range, you're sort of limiting yourself to that customer base who can afford that price range. By offering multiple price ranges, businesses can maximize their potential customer base. This is the same reason that hotels usually have economy rooms, executive suites, all the way up to the luxury penthouse. Having different options in different price ranges maximizes their customer base. Now, the reason we don't see more of it is because, again, the government, through their regulations, sets a floor on the amount of money they need to make in order to operate. So real estate developers and landlords are sort of artificially incentivized to make the price ranges that they offer more top-heavy.
Say you're building a building with 10 units. If you can rent them each out for $4,000 a month, you can make $40,000 a month. And because you can make so much money off of the land, you can sell it for a lot. But what if the city said that you have to sell 3 of those for under $1,500 a month, and 2 of them for between $1,500 and $3,000 a month? Now your maximum rental value is $30,500 a month, almost 25% lower.
What could possibly go wrong?
So yeah, what he's advocating for here is basically a more convoluted version of rent control. It's basically rent control. It's the government putting a cap on how much rent you're allowed to earn from a building. His idea involves extra steps, but that's essentially what's going on. And if you look at the cities where homelessness is the worst, it's usually in places that implement rent control. Because, and this may come as a surprise to you, but as it turns out, if people can't make as much money from providing housing, then they don't want to provide as much housing. Reducing the incentive to provide something means less of it is provided. I know, shocker, right? Who would have guessed?
That'll control land prices because developers know that they can't make as much money off the land as they used to be able to, and it will also encourage developers to build more units on the same land.
Hey pal, you just blowing from Stupid Town?
Wait, you actually believe that putting a cap on the amount of money that a building can earn in rent will actually encourage more people to build rental properties? Like, imagine for a moment that you're a real estate developer, and on top of all the permits, zoning laws, and building codes you already had to go through, the government now wants you to take a 25% cut in profit and land value. How many land developers do you think would be chomping at the bit to sign up for that shit? And he said that this would incentivize developers to build more units on the same amount of land? They're already incentivized to do that. Businesses are already incentivized by the marketplace to maximize revenue while expending as little resources as possible. Like, you're trying to create an incentive that already basically exists.
That'll of course have to be automatically adjusted with inflation.
If you have things your way and the government just goes around throwing free money at shit, you'll probably be needing to adjust quite a bit.
And the last major way that we can make housing more affordable is by taking it out of the hands of the free market.
So real quick, let's just take a moment to discuss what a free market actually is. Because a lot of left-wingers don't seem to understand this. All a free market is simply just people interacting on a voluntary basis. That's it. You know, I'll buy this from you, you'll buy this from me. People shop around, compare prices, see what the best deal is. Nobody points a gun at you and says, you have to buy this from us. It's all voluntary. So when someone says, let's get this out of the hands of the free market, what they're literally saying is, let's get this out of the hands of peaceful people voluntarily trading and point guns at people.
A lot of people have a bad connotation with public housing.
So notice how right off the bat he's trying to paint this whole dichotomy between having a free market for housing and there being public housing available, as if having one somehow entails not having the other. I think it's totally possible that we could generally have a free market for housing, but also have some low-cost or subsidized housing available as an option for low-income people that's perhaps funded voluntarily through donations or run by volunteer charities. Because people on the left seem to have this idea that in order to be generous and care about poor people, you have to threaten people with violence. Like the idea that people who are generous and concerned can just come together and pool their time and resources to help the poor doesn't really compute to them.
People think of it as just bad, poorly maintained housing that shouldn't ever be built.
That's because more often than not, that's how public housing actually is. If you look at a lot of these countries where housing was considered a quote-unquote right, like in the Soviet Union and a lot of the Eastern Bloc countries, you'll see that a lot of the housing there was straight up garbage. In fact, to this day, you can go to Berlin, Germany, and compare the neighborhoods on both sides of the wall, or where the wall used to be, and compare the neighborhoods where housing was provided by capitalism versus by the public sector. Now yes, I'm aware that there are some exceptions. I'm aware that some places, like Red Vienna, did actually have high-quality public housing. But that's like a small drop in the bucket when looking at most of the public housing throughout history, which has mostly been shit.
But the only reason we have that connotation for it is because that was on purpose. Public housing degraded in America because of budget cuts by the Nixon and Reagan administration. It was fine at first, but if you don't maintain it, any building will fall into disrepair. We also built too tall a lot of the time. Construction costs are on a U-curve, and when you get to a certain height, engineering challenges make it more expensive to build higher. 6 to 8 stories is usually the sweet spot for most cities.
So both of these are basically symptoms of the same problem. The government doesn't need to work to earn your money, they can just take it. So there's no incentive to, say, design a building to be efficient to maintain, or even to maintain the building at all. They can just straight up cut the maintenance funding to zero and let the building rot, and what are you going to do about it? There's nothing you can do, you're forced to pay for it whether you want to or not. Like, I'm not against low-cost affordable housing, but to incentivize the building to be maintained properly, you're going to need people in charge of it who have an actual stake in it.
Singapore again proves that this doesn't have to be the case. Most people in Singapore live in public housing, rich and poor alike. And though it varies by price, it's not the rundown holes you might be picturing when you picture public housing.
So yeah, even though most public housing throughout history has been total garbage, like I said, there are a few exceptions. Like earlier I mentioned Red Vienna. But even these exceptions come with caveats. First of all, as with Red Vienna, the public housing in Singapore isn't entirely public. It's kind of complicated. You see, the public housing in Singapore is technically owned by the government, but it's on a 99-year lease, and residents of those buildings are allowed to purchase space within the building, so that makes it kind of quasi-private public. But another important thing to consider is that the reason that Singapore was able to develop all that public housing so quickly and easily is because the government over there is somewhat of a totalitarian dictatorship. Like, the government owns 90% of the land in Singapore, and a lot of that was stolen from people who owned it privately. Also, just like Red Vienna, Singapore public housing comes with all these authoritarian rules. For example, the government restricts what ethnicities can live in the buildings, and your activities are carefully monitored and controlled inside the building. Yeah, I think I'll take my chances with housing I have to pay for. So this point about Singapore isn't exactly wrong, but it doesn't paint the entire picture.
Like I said, the problem was that we built housing and then budgets got cut and that housing wasn't maintained.
That's because the people in charge of that housing had zero incentive to maintain it, and I guarantee you if you try it again, the same thing's gonna happen.
Which is why if we try this, we need to set up automatic funding, something along the lines of like how Social Security is funded, so that it's harder for subsequent administrations to just cut the budgets and undo all the work we did.
Yeah, that's usually how you get runaway financial snowballs that keep accumulating debt. Also, I love the rhetoric that liberals use when they say that these government programs are things you really had to fight and work for. Yeah, like politicians need a lot of convincing to grab for power.
There are ways to sort this out, but the free market isn't the way to do it. The free market is how we got into this mess in the first place.
It's false.
That's straight up wrong. Like, we've never had a free market for housing in this country, like, at all. Like, anytime you've wanted to build anything in this country, even something as simple as a shed, there's always been a fuck ton of permits, codes, and regulations in your way. How is the free market for housing going to get the blame for this when a free market for housing never really existed?
We gave them their chance to do it, and they didn't.
Again, this is straight up false. The free market was never given any sort of opportunity to do anything in housing.
So, now it's time to get involved. We can deal with this, but it'll mean having rules and it'll mean putting in the money and the effort. It's not going to solve itself, and economic forces are not going to solve it unless we put our thumb on the scale.
Notice how he says unless we put our thumbs on the scale. So I take it this guy buys into the whole nonsense of we are the government. That's a topic for another video. But in summary, yes, we do in fact have a housing crisis in this country. But Ian here is putting all the blame on the free market and kissing up to the government to do something about it. Now here's a bit of advice I like to give to left-wingers or people who think government is the answer in general. Before you go advocating that the government step in and do something to solve solve a problem, do a quick bit of research, because whatever problem it is you think we need the government to come in and solve, there's a very good likelihood that that problem was caused by, or at least contributed to, by government. And wouldn't you know it, Ian here wants the government to come in and solve the housing crisis, but with things like zoning laws and building codes making it more difficult to construct housing, and things like rent control making it more difficult for housing to make money, we can see that the culprit here is not the free market, but the very government this guy's kissing up to. As always, this has been Philosophosa making stupidity play dead. Until next time, take care.